Say something. Say something, say something, say something. Say something, Sunganansilia. Say something. 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 Dime varios. Say something. Say something. Furious. Say something. Say something. Say something. Say something. Say something. Am I audible, Jackson? All right. TD Lord Jaco. Am I audible? Aba sakura guru sakwin big guy. Avanda gula World Bank. You tell me I'm set. Ulindinta komwe ive utaziguza. All set. All set. Gives the project on. Good morning and welcome from wherever you are.
We got a friend getting married.
And the theme of this launch is restoring stability rebuilding trust. Our producer, mwenduza chizungu chikubwata mudzimuza ucheni iwo dzindiyankhula chaku mumuyankhula uyu kuti ne ndidzimuona uyu adzindipatsa kiwo. Good morning and welcome from wherever you're watching Zodiak Television this morning. We are in Lilongwe at BICC, the Bingu International Convention Center, where the World Bank is having a launch of its Malawi Public Finance Review Report. And this is actually a report that is themed on restoring stability, rebuilding trust. And the main goal of the report is simply to give an idea, a trajectory of how the economy of Malawi is progressing and how it has been, and also how it could progress by the analysis, but also different kind of assessments that the World Bank has actually done. My name is Sunganansidia, and we will be starting very shortly. Mwina kungo yankula mchiwa jabe tinene kuti tili mu mzinda wa Lilongwe kuno ku BICC kumwene nditu a World Bank wawa akupanga launch kapena kukhazikitsa report lawo limene limakhala likunguza mmene zachuma zakhala zikuyendera, komanso zachuma mmene zikuyendera, komanso kuti kodi zachumazi zikhoza kuyenda bwanji. Mwina kwa amenenso akhoza kukhala ozitsatira bwinobwino report limene lili limabwera ndithu pakadutsa zaka 4 kapena zaka 5 zina zilizonse, chifukwa ndi report limene limakhala likunguza bwinobwino zonse mmene zachuma zakhala zikukhalira. Komanso kuphatikizapo chaka chino ndithu report imene ikhala ili ndika element kena kapena kuti kagawo kena kamene ma report ena amene akhala akubweramo mbuyomo samakhala nako, kamene kaka ndithu ndi mbali imene ikuunika za misonkho kapena kuti ma revenues, mene tax revenues ndi zina zilizonsezo. Maybe just also give an idea, the guest of honor of this event is the country manager of World Bank, who is Philasi Rad, and he's the one who's going to be right here and make sure that facilitates all the discussions that will be happening here. But also there will be a panel discussion where they'll go deep and dive into the details of the report, just to see how has Malawi fared as far as its economy is concerned, but also just to see one of the other elements that is also important in our financial state as it is right now, which is the mining sector. There will be a discussion that will look into the details of how the mining sector is a hope to the nation of Malawi, talking about its finance, how we can rise as a nation with harnessing the potential that is there in the mining sector. So like I said, very soon we'll be coming and we'll be going into the nitty-gritties of the report. Kufotokozanso mwina mchichewa ndi ndimafotokoza kuti ripoti limene lili mwazina zimene likhale likuwunikira mtsiku la leroli ndi gawo lokamba za migodi. Tikudziwa kuti boma la Malawi pakadali pano imodzi mwa ngodya zimenenso ikuyang'anira kwambiri ndi ngodya imene yokhudzana ndi migodi, kuti kodi tingagwiritse bwanji migodi kuti dziko la Malawi lipindule, chifukwa mwina tikangokamba za migodi pamaoneka ngati kuti ndalama zabwera kale, chuma chasintheratu, koma pali zinthu zingapo zimene ndithu zikufunikanso kuti zichitike kuonetsetsa kuti migodi imeneyi, miyala ya mtengo wapatali imene dziko la Malawi lili nalo, ipindule nalo. Mwina kungokamba konso pali zinthu ngati machinery kapenanso kuti maphunziro abwino woyenerera kuti kodi zinthuzo tikaziyenga tikazipeza tingapindule bwanji. So monga tinanenera kuti mlendo amene ali wankulu ndithu wapanopa ndi wankulu wa World Bank kunoku ku Malawi, ndipo sajadapa tikhale ndithu tikuperekani kwa director of ceremony amene ndithu mwambo umenewu akhale akutsogolera mwabwinobwino. Ndinafotokozaponso kuti pamene papa pakhale ndithu panel discussion kapena kuti kukambirana kumene ndithu madera osiyanasiyana, masectors osiyanasiyana, anthu oona za zachuma, anthu oona kuti kodi migodi kuyenda bwanji, anthu oona za ma private sector akhalenso kufotokozerana bwinobwino kuti kodi pamodzi tingatani kuti chuma cha dziko la Malawi chipite patsogolo. So like we are saying, this is an assessment review on how we are fared as far as our finances are concerned, and it's a report that comes normally after 4 years or 5 years, depending with the kind of change that's happening in a particular nation. And maybe to also just give a highlight, this report is one of the core objectives and a core responsibility that the World Bank normally carry in every nation, just to ensure, to give an idea, a trajectory of how any nation is faring and could fare in how they are doing whatever they are doing regarding their finances and economy. So mmodzi somwe anthu amene ndaona pamndandanda amene atakhale nawo pano ndikumakamba za chuma zimene zizi ndi Dr. Betha kuchokera ndithu ku bungwe lija la Economist Association of Malawi, akhale ndithu akuwunikirana bwinobwino ndi anthu enanso osiyanasiyana. Ndimafotokozapo kuti chaka chino report imene iyi akuipanga launch pamutu umene ukuti restoring stability komanso rebuilding trust. Restoring stability, rebuilding trust, kubwezeretsa ndithu kuti kudalirika kapena kuti kukhazikika kwa zachuma, kuti kukhulupirika kwa anthu mu zimene zachuma, ndondomeko zachuma komanso madongosolo onse akabwerere mchimake. Ndi tikukhulupirira kuti report imene ndithu pamene ikupangidwa launch lero tikhale tikuphunziramo zambiri, komanso ngati dziko tiona kuti kodi loopholes athu ndi atiwo, tiwena tipange engage ma policies yanji kuti zachuma ndithu zikhale zikupita patsogolo. So posachedwa pa ndithu tikhale tikuperekani kwa amene akutsogolera mwambo umenewu.
session this morning. Firas Wright, the World Bank Group Country Manager for Malawi, Your Excellencies, your ambassadors, and the members of the diplomatic corps, senior government officials who are here, heads of development partners and agencies, and representatives of the private sector, civil society, members of parliament if you're here, the academia, the media, and distinguished participants. Welcome to our event this morning, where we are disseminating the Public Finance Review report. We also want to welcome those that are joining us live on Zodiak TV and will follow all the proceedings this morning until the end. This report is an analysis of the revenue mobilization, public expenditure, among other areas that the team has been looking into in this country. This morning we will have just a few events going on, so just a quick run through of what's going to go or happen today. We'll have the official opening remarks by Firas Wright, the country manager for World Bank Group in Malawi. Then we'll have the presentation. We'll then have a panel discussion. We'll also open a session for you to ask questions. So we do ask for your active listening and participation as well when that time comes. Thereafter, we'll have the closing session. We'll try to keep time according to our agenda, and we look forward to your active participation. Let me now invite Firas Wright to come and set the tone for the presentation this morning. And thereafter, we'll proceed for the presentation. So over to you, Firas.
Mwazuka Abwanji. Good morning, one and all. Government representatives, members of parliament, distinguished members of the diplomatic and development community, our esteemed panelists, representatives of the private sector and civil society, our friends from the media, good tidings and warm welcome on behalf of myself and all of my colleagues in the World Bank Group country office in Malawi. Allow me at the outset to thank all guests and participants for being with us today to help us launch our new report, the Malawi Public Finance Review, under the title Restoring Stability, Rebuilding Trust. Let me also take a moment to thank the World Bank team led by Jakob Engel and Anwar Musa and all those who contributed to the preparation of this timely and forward-looking report, especially the team from the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning and Decentralization and the Reserve Bank of Malawi. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this new public finance review is both constructive and candid. It provides an in-depth assessment of Malawi's fiscal position and its current macroeconomic crisis, but it's equally clear that decisive, well-sequenced reforms can set the country on a path towards greater stability, resilience, and inclusive growth. Our hope is that this report will serve as a catalyst for dialogue and action, helping the new government under the leadership of His Excellency President Arthur Peter Mutharika in its efforts to restore macroeconomic stability, to protect the vulnerable, and to unlock Malawi's long-term development potential. At the present time, nearly 3 months after the September 16th general election, Malawi stands at a critical inflection point in its efforts to navigate the deep economic crisis and to accelerate development progress. The country's fiscal deficit, as many of you know, remains among the highest in sub-Saharan Africa, financed largely through debt monetization and costly borrowing. Inflation is high, debt is unsustainable, forex shortages persist, the exchange rate premium exceeds 100%, and external financing is declining. Now, at the heart of this chronic set of challenges lies the issue of fiscal dominance, a situation where fiscal policies consistently overshadow monetary policy and drive large deficits and debt accumulation, fueling inflationary pressures, undermining macroeconomic stability, and eroding confidence. Over the past 15 years, the government has spent almost double, or government spending has doubled as a share of the economy, from about 16% of GDP in fiscal 2012 to over 30% in fiscal 2025. Yet the composition has shifted in ways that constrain development. Rigid expenditures now absorb roughly 80% of domestic revenue. Interest payments alone consume more than half of domestic revenue, crowding out priority investments. The public wage bill has grown from less than 3% of GDP in the early 2000s to over 6% in 2024. On the revenue side, progress has been made but remains insufficient. The tax to GDP ratio is nearly 15%, still below the 17% target articulated in Malawi's domestic resource mobilization strategy. The system is somewhat fragmented, with excessive exemptions and incentives that narrow the base and weaken fairness and efficiency. Legislative gaps and administrative bottlenecks further limit collections. The result is a fiscal equation that remains out of balance, where rising interest costs and rigid spending compress the investments needed to accelerate growth and reduce poverty. This public finance review offers a comprehensive set of options that can help the government of Malawi to reverse this downward cycle. First, expenditure rationalization and efficiency. By tightening wage bill management and human resource controls, reforming allowances and travel policies, transitioning to a comprehensive e-procurement system, strengthening public investment management with rigorous project appraisal and selection, and improving public financial management to support realistic budget and execution, Malawi can save between 2.69 and 4.49% of GDP. These are not across-the-board cuts. They are targeted measures designed to ensure that every kwacha that is spent delivers more in services and results. A credible medium-term fiscal framework for the next 5 years should lock in these gains while protecting core high-impact spending. Second, domestic revenue mobilization, rationalizing VAT exemptions and applying a standard rate to petroleum, streamlining and repealing the ineffective corporate tax incentives, modernizing tax administration to close compliance gaps, and expanding property and land taxation can together raise an additional 4.1 to 6.5% of GDP in sustainable revenue. This would reduce reliance on costly domestic borrowing and create fiscal space for development priorities. The objective is not higher taxes for their own sake. It is fairer, broader, and a more efficient system that supports investment, formalization, and growth while meeting Malawi's domestic resource mobilization target and strengthening the social contract. Third, managing fiscal risks, especially from state-owned enterprises. Many SOEs face severe financial stress due to weak governance, low tariffs, and high costs, and their losses have averaged about 2% of GDP annually over the past 5 years. This is not just a balance sheet problem for the enterprises, it is a large and growing contingent liability for the budget. Strengthening SOE oversight and performance frameworks, enforcing hard budget constraints, addressing tariff and cost structures in a transparent, phased manner, and improving disclosure will limit quasi-fiscal activities and reduce the burden on taxpayers. Similar disciplines should be applied to implicit subsidies. It's sectors like fuel, where benefits are often captured by the better-off households. Fourth, responsibly leveraging the country's natural resources while avoiding the resource curse. Malawi's mining sector holds significant promise to diversify exports and mobilize domestic resources, but the challenges are real. Strong legal, regulatory, and fiscal frameworks backed by transparent contracts, robust capacity to tackle base erosion and profit sharing, and clear institutional mandates are essential. Consideration of a sovereign wealth fund and a national mining company should proceed only with clear mandates, strong governance, and full integration with the fiscal framework to ensure that any proceeds translate into strong, long-term, tangible benefits. Across these four areas, the thread that binds the agenda is trust. Restoring stability will require setting realistic fiscal targets, making hard choices and adhering to them year after year. Rebuilding trust requires transparency in how these choices are made and how the resources are used. Strong oversight by Parliament and accountability institutions and clear communication with citizens about the benefits of trade-offs of reform are essential. It also requires protecting low-income households from negative impacts by retaining VAT exemptions on basic consumption goods where justified, and expanding targeted cash transfers to vulnerable populations so that consolidation is both equitable and politically sustainable. So far, we are encouraged by the initial fiscal consolidation measures taken by the new Malawian government, including the reactivation of the automatic fuel price adjustment mechanism, the implementation of austerity spending measures announced by the Chief Secretary, the inclusion of new revenue mobilization measures in the mid-year budget, and the initiation of a review of the civil service headcount. We urge the government to fully implement these measures, to continue along the same path, and to strengthen this agenda as it prepares its National Economic Recovery Plan and its new budget in April 2026. The reforms ahead will require difficult trade-offs, but they are feasible and the gains are material. Combined, the expenditure and revenue measures set out in this review offer potential improvements measured in several percentage points of GDP. Implemented with resolve, they would reduce deficits, ease financing pressures, and create room to reinvest in the foundations of growth and human development. They would also align with Malawi Vision 2063 by restoring macro-fiscal stability as the platform for inclusive private sector-led growth. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, restoring stability, rebuilding trust is more than a subtitle. It's a commitment to doing things differently. Malawi has a window of opportunity to make real improvements in the state of its public finances. With resolve, realism, and partnership, it can set itself on a path towards greater stability, resilience, and inclusive growth. The World Bank stands ready together with other partners to support the government and the people of Malawi in this development effort. I thank you very much, and a big zikomo kwambiri. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Firas, for taking us through in your opening remarks about the report. Now I will invite our senior country economist, Jacob Engel, to take us through the report, which is titled Restoring Stability, Rebuilding Trust. So over to you, Jacob. Please come in front.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Esteemed participants, distinguished panelists, in the interest of time, let me write on protocols previously observed. So first of all, I'd like to mention that I'm presenting this on behalf of a very large team. Obviously, my co-lead, Anwar, and Aya, but we had a very, very large team of experts here in Malawi and global experts who participated in this report over 2 years. And of course, a report like this requires data. It needs new and robust data, and we're particularly grateful to a lot of the government institutions, MRA, DHRMD, Treasury, and many others who made their data available and trusted us that we would make sure that we produced solid analysis on this. I'd also like to take this opportunity, the country manager already mentioned this, to thank the Treasury team and other government institutions for very candid feedback throughout this process. We've tried to incorporate what we found was reasonable, and at times we were going to end up disagreeing, but I think overall it's been a very productive process, and we hope that the engagement can stay strong throughout. So to give a little bit of an overview of the presentation, we're going to go through three different parts. And the first is to kind of take a step back and say, when we talk about public finances, often it can get into the very technical, that this is about budgets, it's about quasi-fiscal operations, it's about top rates of revenue. But I think the argument we make in this report is that public finances are larger than that. It's really about the social contract. And really looking at the understanding between the government and the governed. And that is often reflected in public finances. What quality services are being delivered? How responsive is the government to shocks? How able is it to provide what the population expects? In the second part, we focus on some of the key fiscal dynamics, as well as the situation we find ourselves in now at the end of 2025, as a new government comes in, with some of the key findings from the report. And finally, we look at a trajectory moving forward, how fiscal policy can more effectively support stabilization of the economy and the long-term growth. So maybe to begin with the first part, why does this actually matter for people who are not necessarily budget wonks or fiscal wonks? And there's a quote by a US politician a while ago who was attacked by his opponent, and he said, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value." And I think for us, the way we look at public finances is a way of looking under the hood of a society and understanding the social contract that underpins it, and assess whether we are on the right track to meet the aspirations laid out in the Malawian Constitution, and not to mention Malawi 2063. So obviously there's going to be a lot of graphs, a lot of figures in this, but really this is much bigger than just what is taxed and what is spent. To provide a little bit of context on what we're doing and why we do it, every 4 to 5 years in all our member countries we produce what is now a public finance review. It used to be a public expenditure review, and the objective is to analyze the efficiency and the effectiveness of fiscal policy. And of course we're carrying this out in a context where public finances are under acute strain, and where the risks of not doing anything, where the risks from inaction are escalating. And so we go through all of the different aspects of public finances, the macro-fiscal framework, the public expenditure management, revenue mobilization, the governance of state-owned enterprises, and the potential from the emerging mining sector. And we provide an assessment of some of the challenges and opportunities. And with that, at the end, we provide a costed reform agenda based on some assumptions, of course, but looking at what fiscal consolidation, fiscal reform can do to improve and provide more fair revenue mobilization and taxation, increase the efficiency of public spending, and strengthen governance to anchor stability and unlock long-term growth. And maybe taking as a starting point here the fiscal deficit, which is one of many statistics, but in some ways one of the most telling ones of the performance of fiscal policy. So here we see the period from 2010 to 2019, and during that period Malawi's deficit averaged about 3%. Now if we take this recent period from 2022 to 2024, we see Malawi as a high performer in Africa, precisely in a category where it really wouldn't want to be. The deficit in those years was usually between 11 and 12%. And all of that accumulates into a much deeper crisis that we'll look at over the course of the presentation, and that's illustrated in the report. But I think underlying this is the disappearance of what is called fiscal space. So what does that actually mean in real terms for ordinary people? Here we see what the government spent money on in 2007, 2008. So for every 50 kwacha spent, about 9 went to wages, 4 went to interest payments, 4 went for other rigid expenditures. By that we mean pensions, SOE transfers, and the like. 10 kwacha went to foreign finance development projects, 5 kwacha went from domestically financed development projects, and 18 kwacha of those 50 were for all kinds of other uses, buying goods and services, and so on. Now, 9 years later, we see a quite different picture. At this point, 13 kwacha of those 50 go to wages, 9 go to interest payments, 5 go to other rigid expenditures, a total of 10 go to development expenditures, and we have 14 for other uses, and 1 kwacha is borrowed on top of that to fund the financing gap. Now, in the most recent fiscal year, we see the majority now going to wages and interest. 33 out of the 50 kwacha are just for those 2 expenditures. Another 5 go to other rigid expenditures, and then 14 is foreign financed development spending, projects financed through development partners. 5 is from domestic development financing, and another 6 kwacha on top of that are borrowed to fill that financing gap. So this is a simplistic depiction, but it is there to show just the evolution over the last, has it been 17 years, in terms of the fiscal space that has become increasingly constrained by all of these rigid expenditures. And so I think the argument that we make in this report is that it's important to fix the basics, so money goes where it actually matters. All of these expenditures, interest, wages, and so on, they're there to fund the entire infrastructure of public policy, of public finances, but they don't actually produce a lot on their own to improve the lives of ordinary Malawians. So we see far too little going to schools, to clinics, to roads, to social protection, and a lot of it just going into salaries and debt service. And so getting more value for every kwacha and freeing up space for development spending is really the objective of what we're trying to analyze and understand in this report, and it's essential to restart growth and improve public services. So how did this happen, this deterioration in public finances? If we just look at the most recent period, we start off with a deficit of slightly above 2% in 2016-17, and we end up with a deficit of around 11% in 24-25. So first of all, we see revenues underperforming over this period. We see about 1.5 percentage boost through tax revenues and through other non-tax revenues, another 2%. But then we see this substantial drain through wages and salaries, and especially interest payments and to some extent capital expenditures. And that leaves you with a deficit of almost 12%. Now, looking beyond fiscal policy, we see that all of this then in turn contributes to a lot of the other crises we see in the country: inflation, debt distress, exchange rate depreciation, drained reserves, this entire 4F crisis that we hear so much about, poor services and rising poverty. So we see the overspending over time leads to high debt, and that in turn leads to high interest expenditure, which further constrains the fiscal space. On the external side, we see too many forex inflows, far too few forex inflows to finance imports, and that then further contributes to debt. Then on the external side, we see this excessive financing excessive spending needs to be financed somehow, and so the RBM prints money, which further pushes up inflation. And all of those additional kwacha in the system then drive up the exchange rate. In a sense, you have too many kwacha chasing too few dollars or too few euros. And finally, all of this then contributes to continued low growth and a weak private sector. And that then means that there's too few revenues coming in, which further deepens this vicious cycle. And so fiscal policy, the reason we focus on it so much is because it is the government's single most important lever, the single most important instrument it has to turn around the economy. It's something that is almost fully in its own control, and where it doesn't have to depend as much on external resources, on external dynamics. But as I mentioned at the outset, this goes deeper than just fiscal or macroeconomic policy. Fiscal policy really impacts everyone, and it's essential for a credible, inclusive, and responsive social contract between the government and the governed. So what we see here is an example of, for example, inadequate service delivery. We have at least 100 children in one classroom with one teacher. And we see this also in the data. We see the government effectiveness score declining over recent years compared to some of the other countries in the region. And that means that the government is increasingly unable to provide some of the core services that are expected, protecting the vulnerable, promoting fairness in the tax code and in general public policy, the provision of public goods like decent roads, good education, reliable health care, public safety, a fair system of taxation that taxpayers see as legitimate, honoring obligations to future generations, and being able to respond to shocks. And all of that has in recent years increased distrust in government. So now moving to the key findings of this report of the Public Finance Review. And the report is about 150 pages long. It has 200 figures. We're really just focusing on some of the key outcomes and findings in it. So as mentioned before, these successive fiscal deficits over time have contributed to a debt crisis, and that's crowded out a lot of development spending and private sector lending. Here on the left, we see a gradual accumulation of public debt since we had the HIPC debt relief in 2005-2006, to a point where now, in 2024, 1.4 trillion kwacha were spent just on interest payments, of which 96% went to domestic creditors, to essentially the banking system. And that has dramatically increased the financial sector's exposure to government. We see that primarily government debt is primarily held, the financial sector primarily holds government debt, and that yellow line is what it actually lends to the private sector. And when we look at what that actually means in detail, looking at one individual treasury auction, we see that this is a treasury auction that took place in March. Treasury raised about 36.5 billion, but we'll have to pay back almost 70 billion on that. And we'll have to pay interest payments of anywhere from 11 to 15% semi-annually. And so while this borrowing is necessary to fund spending needs in the short term, it's not a sustainable strategy. Over time, this becomes unaffordable, and you do begin to see risks and fragility in the financial sector. And it also explains why interest bill is now the biggest component in the budget. The second finding is the importance of exchange rate distortions and implicit subsidy in undermining public finances. In a sense, these are hidden costs, whether it's the exchange rate misalignment, and on the right you see the growing gap between the official rate and the parallel rate, as well as the parallel market premium. And of course, someone benefits from that delta, that difference between the official and the parallel rate. And of course, those are the people who have access to Forex at the official rate. While it hurts most consumers, it hurts exporters, and at the end of the day, it also hurts Treasury. But we also see that the RBM creates significant costs for some of these exchange rate losses over time. That's cost an additional 1.9% of GDP annually over the last 3 fiscal years, just to bring on board some of the exchange rate losses they've made through this process. We also see this in SOEs, which we'll discuss a little bit more later, but we also see that in some of the subsidies that have been provided. At least until October, until the price adjustment, Malawi, at the parallel exchange rate, had some of the cheapest fuel, not just in the region, but in the world, significantly cheaper than many oil producers. And of course, that the official exchange rate is quite expensive, but a lot of these transactions take place at the parallel rate. And even when they don't, of course, it's important to take the market price into account to think about what fuel actually costs. And all of that comes at a large cost to taxpayers. This fuel distortion we saw over almost 2 years has cost almost 1 trillion kwacha, and eventually that is currently as arrears, but eventually will have to be brought onto the books. We've also seen a quite dramatic increase in spending, as I mentioned before, driven especially by interest payments, but also a worsening in fiscal governance. So here we see the main components of spending, and we see that the biggest drivers have been compensation of employees and interest payments. We see a doubling of total expenditure to over 30%, and that is not essentially affordable by the revenues the country collects. Essentially, the country spends like a middle-income country and collects revenues like a low-income country. Rigid expenditures, so these interest, wages, payments, transfers, and so on, now consume almost 90%. And we see a massive expansion in the wage bill, from 2.5% to over 6%, driven primarily by increased hiring and not so much by increased salaries, as well as a very inequitable and rising allowance bill that primarily goes to the best off, to the highest grade civil servants. Just looking at the past election year, since January 2025, we've seen more than 30,000 civil servants added to the payroll. And we also see that initially approved budgets are routinely not adhered to. We have significant challenges with budget discipline. So budgets tend to be approved by Parliament, then we see overspending over the course of the year, and by the time the new budget is announced, we usually see this huge discrepancy that then has to be filled by borrowing. But in the meantime, Parliament and most people have moved on to focus on the new budget. And a lot of this is driven, in part, maybe deliberate strategy, but a lot of it is just driven by weaknesses in some of the underlying systems of fiscal governance, public financial management, audit, procurement, and so on. And these are some of the areas we focus on in our recommendations. So the result of this is that there's far too little money available for development spending. We've seen a negative savings rate since at least 2014, so that on average the country borrows more than it's able, or consumes more, borrows more than it's able to invest. And the investment rate has been relatively flat and mostly driven by public investment, including development partner investment. And this means while we have seen an increase to some extent of development expenditure, a lot of that has just been driven by a stepped-up effort by development partners to fill some of the financing gaps following COVID and a lot of the shocks in recent years. And we also see a lot of that spending used in very inefficient ways. Here we have an analysis of the performance of the AIP program, and previously FISP, and now again FISP. And we see that actually the spending on the subsidy, which is the blue bars, has very little relationship to actually how much maize is harvested. The single largest factor is the weather. So in some years, there's been very high expenditures, especially in the early years of the last government. In some years, it was quite contained, as during the last DPP government. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of what the actual maize harvest looks like. And we see this across other projects as well, right? Whether it's a small police station or it's a giant AIP budget, we see that overall the efficiency could be much better, the rigor and screening could be much better, cost-benefit analyses could be included in a much more systematic way. On the tax side, we do see significant progress. Over past 10 years, the tax to GDP ratio has increased by 4% to over 14. But still, this remains so far below spending needs, right? The country is, on the whole, more successful in collecting revenues than many other low-income countries, but it spends like a middle-income country, and that gap then has to be filled by borrowing. We also see quite extensive economic distortions arising from exemptions, incentives, and just straight-out evasion, especially by the best off. And we've seen only quite limited improvements in tax administration since 2015. Now we're moving forward with the implementation of Masonko Online, the tax administration system, as well as the electronic invoicing system for VAT, but a lot of these programs systematically run behind schedule. And what we also see is that in practice, the tax code ends up being highly regressive. Here we see what firms actually pay in terms of their effective tax rate, in terms of their effective VAT tax rate, at the time 16.5%. And from left to right, we see the smallest firms, SMEs, micro SMEs, to the largest firms, your Lovos and the like, on the right side. And we see the larger a firm gets, the smaller their share of taxes is. And that's just because large firms can hire better accountants, they have better lawyers, and they can find a lot more loopholes in the tax code to make sure that they minimize their tax liability. So this is not necessarily illegal, it's just a matter of taking advantage of a tax code that's riddled with exemptions. And of course we see that in other ways too, right? Just going through Lilongwe, you frequently see cars and other vehicles that don't have license plates and therefore are able to avoid certain taxes and other non-tax revenues, as well as fines in certain cases. And this is something that in some ways normalizes tax evasion. in a way that is increasingly concerning. Of course, I think this is something that the government has announced they will crack down on, but it is something that you have begun to see, especially in the most fancy cars, to become increasingly systematic in the nicer parts of Lilongwe and Blantyre. The finding number 7 is that Malawi's SOEs are creating substantial financial risks and hidden liabilities. Here from left to right, you see the profit and loss of trading SOEs in 2024. And we see that Eskom and Blantyre Water Board, between the two of them, are accumulating over 100 billion in liabilities and losses just for 2024. And this is driven by significant issues in governance, macro-fiscal distortions, as well as the understanding that SOEs will periodically be bailed out. We have issues we see issues of political interference, poor oversight, lack of transparency, as well as pricing that does not reflect the costs. And as with the fuel subsidies, these implicit subsidies almost exclusively benefit the richest 20% of Malawians. So there's already quite a bit that is being done in the SOE sector in terms of moving towards an enterprise risk management framework, conducting annual audits and consolidated reports. But I think there's a more fundamental question about assessing the shareholder strategy of government, thinking about where government actually has the capacity to be actively engaged in, and where it should focus its energies. And I think we also have positive examples, like the Lilongwe Water Board, which shows that an ailing SOE can be turned around over a series of years if the right reforms are in place and the right reformers are in charge. And so here, for example, we see the increasing cost of Eskom, Blantyre Water Board, and the Lilongwe Water Board as a share of GDP, just from mispricing, arrears, and excessive losses. And we see that that adds up to more than 2% of GDP in most recent years and has been increasing. And finding 8 is on the mining sector, and this is the second deep dive we have in the report, in addition to the SOE sector. And we look at the potential of 7 large mining projects. These are the ones you read about in the news: Kasia, Kailakera, Kanyika, Songwe Hills, and so on. And our assessment of this is that mining revenues could play a significant role in 5 years. But on its own, the sector is not going to be the type of game changer that people often talk about. It will be significant, so this is a business as usual scenario. We would expect to see something around 200 to 300 million potential, primarily through corporate income tax, by the early 2030s. And in a better case scenario, this could go all the way up to $500 or $600 million. But this is still less than 1 trillion kwacha, and there's a much larger financing gap that needs to be filled. So this is not, Malawi is not on the way to sort of being like Saudi Arabia, where it can fully rely on its extractive resources. There's also quite a bit that the government can do to make the fiscal regime more progressive and adaptable. Make sure that it doesn't always have to negotiate new mining development agreements, but that it has a legal framework that it can just take to investors and say, this is what we're going, this is our framework, take it or leave it. We also feel that maximizing revenue collection will require a stronger focus on enhancing sector efficiency and transparency, reducing leakages, and improving revenue management. And here the issue of what Malawi does with its national mining company and its sovereign wealth fund will be critical moving forward to make sure that there's a clear objective for this, there's a clear mandate, and a clear governance and clear and transparent governance structure of any fund or mining company that ensures that these fund activities are in fact integrated with fiscal and budgetary frameworks that a sovereign wealth fund under the government cannot conduct off-budget operations. So now to conclude the third section, which focuses really on the way forward. How can fiscal policy be a driver of stabilization and growth? And here we pick up on the President's inaugural speech, where he said, Malawi's crisis is a man-made crisis. Our situation is not a permanent condition. Any problem created by humans can be solved by humans. Malawi's situation is a problem we can solve, and solve it we will. And I think for us, this is a starting point to really think about and take heart on the fact that there is an increasing recognition at the highest levels of government that this crisis can be addressed, needs to be addressed, and gradually is being addressed. We look at the DPP manifesto, which focused on quite significant fiscal reforms, improved debt management, with a very ambitious fiscal consolidation path, moving towards a primary surplus by 2026. The new OPC austerity measures that aim to curb non-essential spending and strengthen fiscal discipline, and the mid-year budget, which had significant tax measures targeting a primary surplus for the second half of the year. But I think across all of these, the question always becomes implementation, right? Can all of these ambitions, all of these measures actually be implemented the way they've been announced? So we focus on some of the additional fiscal reforms that could come. Now, this is the figure we had earlier that shows sort of this descent into a valley of increasingly higher deficits over the years, and look at the way out of that valley. We focus on a couple of key aspects on the revenue and on the expenditure side. And beginning with the former, we focus on VAT exemption reform, and fully implementing some of the exemptions, especially for the privileged people, privileged individuals, and non-food items, as well as the introduction of a standard rate on petroleum. And that could raise about 1.5% to 2.5% of GDP. We also look at the impact of a complete systems integration and the adoption of digital technologies in tax administration. That would be about 1.1% to 2% of GDP. And we focus on wealth taxes, focusing in particular on recurrent property taxation, expanding digital billing, the taxation of estates, and those combined could add about 0.5% to 1% of GDP. And we have a number of other measures, but this is more indicative. On the expenditure side, we look at all of the main drivers of increased expenditures, beginning with the wage bill. And here a key aspect is integrating HR systems into the IFMIS and really finally getting rid of a lot of the ghost workers and duplicates in the payroll, as well as a hiring freeze for non-essential positions and containing wage growth, especially at the higher grades. On procurement, we focus on finalizing the transition to a comprehensive e-procurement system, which could bring in about 0.8% to 1.4% of GDP, as well as some other measures on public investment management, improved screening, PFM as well. And that gets you back to the fiscal balance you had about 10 years ago. Now, what if nothing is done? What if the current trajectory continues? We model in the report what business as usual will lead to and what kind of fiscal deterioration this would look like. We model the worsening of primary deficits in the scenario from about what they were in 2022 to 2024, progressively down to an 8% primary deficit for the period from 2026 to 2035. Over that time period, the deficit would increase to over 20%. Public debt would reach over 100% by 2030 and 140% by 2035. And we see here the difference between the primary deficit and the fiscal deficit, and all of that gap are interest payments that the government would then have to pay. And not only would that slow the economy further, the cost of living would rise, inflation would increase, real wages would decline, but we'd also see an increased weakening investor confidence, financing conditions would deteriorate, and the domestic financial system would face increasing stress and default risks. So this is a worst-case scenario, but I think it is useful to illustrate what would happen if restraint in spending and under-collection of taxes were to persist and gradually worsen. But we also look at two reform scenarios, and those are based on a phased implementation of some of the proposed fiscal savings measures. The first of those is a big push reform, which involves the full implementation of the proposed measures over the next 3 years, that is then sustained over the following years all the way to 2035, and that would mean fiscal savings of around 6.5% to 10.3%. And the second one is a more gradual reform scenario that acknowledges some of the technical and political economy challenges that ministers and governments would face with significant savings like that. And even that would lead to savings of about 4.3% to 6.9%. And I think maybe just to highlight some of the logic, some of the assumptions underlying these scenarios, the focus is really on fixing the basics. So the reform strategy aims to focus primarily on improving simplicity, efficiency, progressivity of fiscal policy, and removing a lot of the distortions. The aim is to increase the simplicity and the fairness of the tax system and remove a lot of the sources for rent seeking and leakages. Another aspect of this is that we don't focus just on austerity. Underlying these scenarios is that there's going to be a partial reinvestment of these savings into health, education, and electrification. So the idea is not just to do pure debt reduction, but also to reallocate spending towards more productive uses. And finally, the medium-term focus here is on achieving positive growth and poverty reduction outcomes, while focusing efforts of government on those who can, focusing our savings most on those who can afford it the most. And in our scenarios, we don't include wider structural reforms, we don't include SOE reforms, we don't include any kind of domestic debt treatment, though that, of course, would impact outcomes. So under the gradual reform scenario, we would see significant benefits before 2030. That's the light blue line. Malawi would achieve a primary surplus by 2028, public debt would fall to 68% by 2030, and interest payments would decrease by almost 2%. And GDP growth would increase to 4.4% of GDP by 2030, significantly above the baseline. Now, this more ambitious big push reform scenario would be more dramatic. We would see a primary surplus 1 year earlier by 2027, and a 3.8% primary surplus by 2030 to 35. Public debt would decline by 5.5% to 55% over a 10-year period, and GDP growth would be significantly higher. And if this was paired with structural reforms on trade, on competition, on the exchange rate and other areas, results would be significantly better. And this would be the growth curve. And I think one thing to make clear is that in all of these outcomes, you do see a hit in the first year or two of reform implementation that is then equalized over the years after that, because you're just taking a lot of money out of the system. So I think we have to be honest here and acknowledge that if you do fiscal consolidation, you're not going to get the same kind of growth that you would get without these kind of reductions in public spending. But it does pay off over time, and we see that by 2028, 2029, we are already above the baseline estimate we would have been otherwise. Finally, we focus in the report on the how. How do you actually move forward with this kind of significant reform agenda? One aspect is making sure that you have effective sequencing, focusing first on the quick win measures in the short term, and then moving on to some of the more complex, more difficult, more foundational medium-term actions that involve more difficult reforms. Second priority is protecting low-income households from negative impacts, and that would involve also, for example, retaining VAT exemptions on a lot of basic consumption goods, maize, cooking oil, and the like, and providing targeted cash transfers to the most vulnerable population. Third aspect is strengthening institutional capacity in order to ensure reform sustainability. And this can be achieved through technical assistance, through support from the private sector, from development partners, from other governments, as well as improved data systems for real-time monitoring. And finally, clear communication and making a strong case for reform to elites, to unions, to business leaders, media, civil society, in order to help counter some of the inevitable resistance on tax policy and public sector reforms. So trying to build coalitions and persuading your partners and other members of society that over the medium term these reforms are necessary and will pay off. And there's lessons from other countries that show that this is doable. If we look at the reforms in Zambia over the last 5 years, we see first a substantial crisis in 2019-2020 when Zambia defaulted on its debt, and then a very rapid recovery that was supported by a really sustained commitment to difficult reforms, a focus on deficit reduction, improved debt management, increasing revenues to improve services, scaling up social protection just to cushion the impacts, as well as reforms in the wider private sector, energy sector reforms, a focus on increasing FDI and exports, and building foundations for a future mining boom that they are now benefiting from. But we can also look more close just in this country and learn from some of the lessons from the crisis in the early 2000s and the recovery from that crisis. So as many of you know better than I do, starting in the mid-1990s, Malawi experienced probably its most severe economic crisis of the post-independence era. And from 2000 to 2005, the Malawian authorities took difficult but significant reforms to reduce inflation and foster economic recovery. It involved monetary tightening, reducing the money supply, fiscal consolidation with strict expenditure management, collecting interim dividends from parastatal, taxation of housing allowance for the most high-ranking civil servants, and a lot of revenue measures to gradually stabilize public balances. And a lot of that was boosted by wider structural reforms. And so when we look at this period from 2002 to 2005, often the focus is on what happened during HIPC. But these were reforms that set the foundations for the HIPC debt relief that then came, where you went from 100% debt to GDP to 80%. And then HIPC came, a lot of fiscal space was created, and you saw a growth boom in the first term of Bingu's government. So just to conclude, the three main takeaways from the Public Finance Review. So undoubtedly, Malawi faces probably its most severe fiscal crisis in recent history. We've seen persistent fiscal slippages, and that's pushing public debt onto an unsustainable path. We argue in the report that business as usual is not going to keep working, and there needs to be a change of direction as the economic and social costs of inaction are escalating. Fiscal consolidation and restoring stability and rebuilding trust is urgently needed. We focus in the report on various options for expenditure rationalization, improving efficiency, reforming revenues that could save between 8 to 14% of GDP annually. And of course, we don't expect all of these to be implemented, but they provide a menu of options for governments to choose from and explore as potential future fiscal savings. But without those sustained efforts to fix foundations, there is a risk of deeper debt distress and prolonged economic stagnation. And our focus is not so much about collecting more revenue, but really collecting in a better and fairer way, improving the progressivity of the system, and including more extensive taxation of the rich. And on the spending side, we would focus much more on reducing non-priority expenditures, such as the wage bill and travel, that can create space for increased investment in social sectors. Not the wage bill as such, but a lot of the fringe benefits and a lot of the growth of the wage bill. And finally, this needs to be accompanied by a wider agenda and roadmap of structural and governance reforms for long-term stability. We argue for a roadmap that combines fiscal consolidation with governance improvements, with pro-growth reforms that support the private sector, better resource management, and over time this will help restore trust, rebuild credibility for the government, and help achieve the goals of Malawi Vision 2063. And fairness and transparency really need to be front and center. So I hope that 5 years from now, when we produce our next public finance review, we can look back on this experience over the current government when stability was restored, when trust was regained, and better understand how Malawi turned the corner and what it can teach other countries. It's a difficult position right now, but I think there is the momentum, there is the willingness there, and in this report we've tried to provide some of the evidence and some of the analysis that can help support a sequenced, coherent reform agenda. And so with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to the insights and observations from our esteemed panel. Thank you.
Well, we can do more in the clapping hands, right? All right, great. Thank you so much, Jakob, for taking us through the presentations. And a vote of thanks to also all the authors who have contributed to this tremendous work. You've given us so much for a short period of time. But I hope our panelists later on are going to provide more insights on their reflection on what has been put across. So ladies and gentlemen, let me now invite Ephraim Montari, who is going to take us through the panel discussion. As some of you already know, but Ephraim is the managing editor of The Nation Publications Limited. He's a well-known author and a columnist in the Nation newspaper. If you buy weekend newspapers, especially the Weekend Nation, you go straight to Cut the Chaff column. And he's the author. He's been very consistent on his messaging on that column, and quite hard-hitting at some point in time. So let me invite Ephraim to come in front. Ladies and gentlemen, give him a round of applause as he comes on stage.
Thank you, Henry, for that kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. All protocols observed in the interest of time, because I think we already ate into the time. Quite a depressing presentation, it has to be said. But at the same time, I think it points to certain opportunities that can be taken advantage of. Clearly, the key discussions are going to rotate around public expenditure management, revenue mobilization, state-owned enterprises in terms of their governance, as well as the emerging mining sector, where expectations are being built that maybe this is what can bring in some sort of windfall. So in order to discuss these key issues, I have a lineup of 4 distinguished leaders in economic policy in this country. Let me start with Ms. Linga Mihowa. Ms. Mihowa is a civil society and governance advocate, and I think a long-time crusader in both economic and social policy, and a well-known figure in that particular area. Welcome, ma'am. And then you heard about the kind of brave policy decisions that were being made between 2000 and 2005 at a time of a similar crisis. At that time, the governor was Dr. Elias Ngalande, who is one of the panelists here. So Dr. Ngalande is a former governor of the Reserve Bank of Malawi, and he was quite key in the area that when Jacob was presenting about that. Let me invite Dr. Ngalande to the stage, please. The third panelist is someone who is well known in the academic circles, but also a long-time public servant, steering economic policy for some time and leading in the discussion in this national conversation on economic policy in the country. He is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Malawi. Dr. Winford Masanjala, please. And lastly, but certainly not the least important, is Dr. Betha Bangara-Chikat. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Malawi and the president of the Economics Association of Malawi, and in her own right, really a leading figure when it comes to providing insight into economic policy and what can be done for the country to get out of here. Dr. Bangara-Chikat, please welcome and join us. Now, the key takeaway here appears to be fiscal consolidation, really as the way forward. But as we have seen from the mid-year budget presentation, fiscal consolidation would usually be very painful. And noise started coming out when certain taxes are being raised and certain expenditures actually being cut. And so as the report actually showed, in detail, I must say, that Malawi is in a deep fiscal crisis. What I would like us to start discussing is what practical steps would you recommend to the government on two fronts? One, to help reduce spending demands while still protecting the core services. That's on one part. On the other hand, what do you see as the single most important revenue measure that you would like to see in the coming budget? Let me start with you, Dr. Scott.
Thank you so much. And thanks for that. I think we all know the problems of Malawi, and these have been recurrent. One thing that I think I always say is we don't give the World Bank the tough time in terms of analysis, because most of the things that we see are the same things year in, year out, whether government changes or doesn't change. But I think one thing that I would want to see, apart from the tax measures that tend to be announced every now and then, is stopping the bleeding. I would say about the bleeding because I don't think the country has a financing problem. It has a fiscal discipline problem. And when I'm saying that, I mean a fiscal discipline in terms of how we finance our expenditures vis-a-vis our revenue. But even in the revenue collection itself, there is a lot of leakage. And that plus I would say, the incentives that we tend to give, maybe to attract investments or to give to other high-profile people in the country in terms of, they're supposed to pay this, but they don't pay. If you add all that, plus what we see being leaked along the process, if we could consolidate everything and close the leakages and stop the bleeding, I think we should be on the right track. But we end up now taxing the very same things, the very same people, the very same institutions and corporations that are already being taxed. I believe we can do better if we could consolidate things properly, if we could manage the way we collect our revenue, if we could bring in the informal, non-taxed grouping, which is actually large. If we take the proportion of the population that is paying tax is actually very small as compared to those who are not. And I think that is something that I would want to see, a very first thing. Thank you. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Dr. Masanjala.
Thank you very much. So I will not repeat the areas that she has already covered. But I think if you look at what's coming out, if you look at the level of the central government, we need what we call an agency of restraint for central government. The idea of an agency of restraint for central government is that there is need for commitment control in the public financial management in government. How is it possible for a government department or ministry to spend all its budget in one half of the year? There's no agency of restraint. There's nothing to restrain that controlling officer in terms of spending. That's number one. Number two is fiscal accountability. The budget is low. But neither the Minister of Finance nor Parliament treats the budget as a law. In other words, if somebody violates the budget, they should be treated as the same person who violates the penal code. Because both are laws. But in Malawi, we take the budget as a suggestion. And the other things are then criminal. So you will not remember anybody who was arrested or fired for overspending. And in that way, there is no agency of restraint to restrain a controlling officer from overspending. So that's at the level of central government. If you look at the level of the public sector, then the main argument that can be made is government should remove implicit subsidies and move towards cost reflectivity. The point I'm making here is very simple. Blantyre Water Board sells a liter of water at below cost. ESCOM sells electricity at below cost. Nobody will survive in business when they are selling an item or a commodity below the cost at which they bought. And this is not a problem for ESCOM. You can fire them as many times as we can fire the CEOs. But it's not their problem. It's not a problem of Blantyre Water Board. It's a policy problem at Capitol Hill. Because ESCOM buys electricity from independent power producers in US dollars. The last time we devalued, ESCOM presented to government the adjustment that was needed in the tariff in order for them to break even. And the government refused to adjust ESCOM's tariff. So ESCOM is now buying at a higher rate, but they're still selling at the same price. In one devaluation, ESCOM made a loss of 40 billion. So if you are ESCOM, what do? If you are here today and the following week you have a bill of 40 billion and the government that you serve refuses you to adjust the tariff. When ESCOM came up with the tariff that was proposed, the first organization to go to government to lobby that government refuse the tariff was Blantyre Water Board. Blantyre Water Board is the single largest customer for ESCOM because Blantyre Water Board has to pump water from the Shire River 1 kilometer up. The revenues for Blantyre Water Board are over half go to ESCOM. Therefore, Blantyre Water Board cannot survive if tariff for ESCOM is adjusted. But Blantyre Water Board itself, when it goes to government, for government to adjust its tariff, government also refuses. Therefore, you have a dying public sector because the government has wrong policies. It thinks it loves the people when in actual fact it's killing service provision to the public sector and to the citizens of the country. Which brings us to the issue that you raised about the social contract between government and the governed. Government in Malawi is so loving that it's killing the people.
Thank you very much. But before you go, Prof, you have concentrated on tightening the systems and bringing discipline and being able to allow market forces dictate prices in certain areas, including tariffs. But I really wanted if you see a possibility on the revenue side, particularly on the tax revenue side, whether, yes, we have to solve the expenditure side of it, but then can we really line away from the revenue side of it? Is it feasible? And in what areas of tax revenue do you see improvement helping on the revenue side? Because clearly MRI isn't even meeting the targets of its own strategy that is set out. So that's clearly a problem. So I thought you should delve into that a little.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. When you look at the Malawi domestic revenue mobilization strategy, it says government should target reaching about 17% of tax to GDP as a ratio. So the question that you ask is really very important. Can government reach even that target? And from where I sit, the answer is yes. The problem that we have currently, one of them, Jacob highlighted, is exemptions. So you have a VAT regime which is full of exemptions and zero rating. So although the VAT seems applicable to different players, they are not paying because they are exempted from a number of them. That's number one. Number two, we can increase the revenue by increasing the revenue base. Right now, all the measures that government pronounced in the mid-year budget are falling on the same people that is already taxing. So we are still milking this cow dry. But if you look at the Malawi economy, you must understand 87% of Malawi economic activity happens in the informal sector. So government is really taxing a very small base. What are they doing to formalize the informal sector? Because if they formalize the informal sector, then you could increase the tax base. One of the reasons the informal sector is not willing to be formalized is that the value proposition is not there. If MRA goes to a company for formalization and registration, and the company knows they are only trying to register us to tax us, they will never accept to be formalized. So the value proposition does not come in. Government needs to have a strategy which says, if you are registered and formalized, then there is this portion of government business that will go to those that are formalized and registered. Then there is at least an incentive for them. And then you need to diversify your revenue sources. And mining has come up as one of those sources of diversification. But this can only go so far. But we need everybody to start paying taxes and remove some of the exemptions and zero ratings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Ngalande, really, how can government reduce spending demands while still protecting core services? And to what extent can we really create room for revenue?
Thank you for that question. I think my colleagues have covered a little bit of the expenditure controls that need to be in place. When Jacob showed me that Land Cruiser, I thought he was going to talk about the expenditure that one Land Cruiser actually incurs for government. I think under the expenditure controls, perhaps one of the things that needs to be done is to look at the items that actually contribute, or I call them instruments of expenditure. How many of them do we have in government? And the government fleet is probably one that needs to be rationalized, as much as we talk about also rationalizing the manpower in the civil service. My colleague has said the government is so loving to an extent of actually killing its own people. I think we think perhaps by padding government positions, then we are actually loving the people. But what we are doing is actually destroying the country in a very big way. You look at procurement, you look at the wastage that is there, you look at the multiplicity of executives in government, and by this I mean, if you don't like a particular, let me use the example of a PS, you actually don't just retire them and pay them off, but you warehouse them to what is called sometimes Guantanamo. And we have many of them. If you look at OPC, it's full of PS for administration or PS for what, PS for what. And that's where you just throw people when you don't know what to do with them. So one of the ways is to look at those aspects of wastage and eliminate them. I want to agree with Associate Professor Bangara that I don't think there's no money in Malawi. There's plenty of money. The problem is it's not going to the intended areas where it needs to be spent. Let me give you another example where I think we could also cover a lot of ground, which is that there needs to be accountability. And I know people will say, yes, there is accountability in government. But if you look at private sector, accountability is done annually. And it's instantaneous, more or less. So if I do something wrong in expenditure management, I don't have to wait for 5 years for somebody to come and quiz me up, because the audit will be done a few months after. And actually the problem will be spotted. In government, I think by now they are probably auditing 2020 figures. And really it's pointless. Who are you going to hold accountable? The expenditure happened 5 years ago. The person has moved on, maybe even retired, or they have died. So who are you going to hold accountable? So we need to strengthen also accountability in terms of making sure that not too much time is wasted on identifying areas where wastage has occurred. The revenue side that I think we can strengthen is that there's decentralization. There are departments that collect revenues, but how many of them actually send their collections to MG account number 1? I'll take an example that everyone will relate to. I've never seen traffic police records in terms of how much they collect in fees, for instance, the fines that they impose on motorists. It's not accounted for. People have been crying for the toll gates, the 2 toll gates that we have. How much money have they collected since they were opened? And where is the money going? What is it used for? Because we are still dodging potholes, perhaps even worse than the ones we were dodging before the toll gates. So these are some of the revenue areas that if somebody would simply require accountability from departments that collect revenues, would probably have the much needed money that we need. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngalande, for that response. Ms. Moho, I'm particularly interested to listen from you because the inequality issues versus taxation and versus fiscal consolidation, where you need to tighten spending, that delicate balance, and still be able to support pro-poor programs. What is your position?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I think the report has been balanced. And I say this because it's looking at ways in which we can quickly rebound, looking at the various options that have been given. But also I think at the center of it has been the issue around protection of the most vulnerable, and also calling government's attention to spending in the areas that have the best impact or the most immediate impact on the poor, like health, education, social protection. I think the report is very clear and balanced in that way. But I guess one of the critical issues that government will also have to look at is the issues of the more prudent they are in terms of the spending, in terms of safeguarding what they have collected, the likelihood that it's going to have a positive impact on the poor. Because as you saw when Jacob was presenting, there's very limited fiscal space for government to be able to spend on development programs, on programs that impact the poor. So I think my colleagues have already elaborated the issues around the prudence in terms of what we have, stopping the leakage, but also I think the issues of prioritization in terms of being consistent with what we want to do as a country, and also at the same time then being able to look at how do we broaden the tax base so that you're not just punishing the few, but you have a wider base which does not penalize a significant portion of people. But also the report has been very clear that some of the subsidies that we are making, they're not necessarily benefiting the poor. They're basically increasing the inequality. So if you look at issues around the subsidies on the fuel products, if you look at the utility boards not being able to charge their tariff at a cost-reflective tariff, if you look at the graphs that have been shown, it actually shows that quite a lot of that, the beneficiaries are not necessarily the poor. So I think an issue of reviewing what kind of subsidies we are making, and also being able to be prudent in the resources. But when it comes to taxation, I think the report is also very clear in terms of protecting some of the goods that the poor people need and making sure that those are not subject to heavy taxation. But over and above, my colleagues already touched on the many issues that I had in terms of where they can, government can reduce spending and also generate revenue. But I think a critical point has been made around accountability, and I think that's what we lack as a country, where people can go scot-free even when they have, flouted the law. And if the budget is the law, and budget is the law, then I think we need to be seeing more stronger accountability. And it's not just a matter that has not been tried to. I know previously we had an ST that actually put in stricter measures of making sure that you don't get your next disbursement if you have not been able to submit your returns and accounted for it. But we didn't see that go further, because there were also some resistance against that. But those are the kind of things that we need to be going towards, where people are being held accountable and it is not business as usual. And I think for Malawi, what drives change is when there is political commitment. I think we need to be looking at the political economy in which these reforms are going to be implemented. And I know that Jacob talked about successful implementation, effective sequencing, protection of the poor, institutional capacity support, and also seeking coalitions to internalize the reforms. But I think at the centerpiece for Malawi, we have seen that where reforms have gone forward is only because there is political commitment. And I say this knowing that this government has an advantage of being in government, having learnt from the past. The DPP government was there, it went out, it's come back. I think there is no better advantage that you can have than the DPP in terms of knowing how things have been done, learning from what have been some of the things that have gone well and some of the things that have been a recurring pain in the economy. And I think the best thing is, one, really making sure that they are walking the talk, and I believe that they will, given the marching orders that the president made in his inaugural speech. So we are expecting to see things not being done business as usual. We are expecting more of things that can change the economy, because we know they are coming with the experience of having run government before. So their learning cycle is really short because they've been there. So we do expect that quite a lot of what has been proposed in the report and what the panelists have said is also going to be anchored by strong political commitment to make things work for Malawi.
Thank you. Please hold on to the mic, because I wanted to come with a follow-up question, particularly on the issue of expenditure. In the report, you notice that since 1994, deficits rise by 74% during election years. 74%. And the most recent election likely also saw significant overspending and lapses in fiscal governance. That's very clear. And we have seen every time there's a new administration come in, we have inherited nothing. We have inherited nothing in the account number one. Now, this appears to be a recurring problem, and I think it's worsening going by the recent election. How can Malawi break this cycle of election year in discipline? Let me start with you, Ms. Mihor.
Yeah, thank you. It's sad that it's recurring. And particularly also, I think the figures are showing that it was even more pronounced now in terms of huge spending outside budget. I think this year, upon reflection, was also particularly tricky because one, the budget is passed in April, then we have an election in September by law. I want to suspect that there could have been temptation that let's blow up what has been allocated in the budget, because if we get re-elected, then we'll try to sort that out. If we don't get re-elected, then that's their shauri, they'll sort it out. So the whole thing around not owning this thing as stewards that are entrusted with the public pace, I think it's difficult, and it could have happened with any other government that, okay, look, we will win the election, therefore we'll do what we can, we'll fix it, or if we don't, then that's their shauri, they'll clean it up. But I think we need to stop this, and I think one of the critical issues is around accountability strengthening. The Public Finance Management Act, I think it's very clear in terms of what's expected from the controlling officer, what's expected from the Minister of Finance, and even the parliamentary budget finance. But the extent to which there are credible processes to actually, operationalize that accountability, I think is a problem. Because if we know that there's going to be budget overruns, we know that, people put in a lot of things in the budget in the election year, I think there should be a way in which we can make sure that there are stricter and tighter accountability mechanisms, so that this is not just discovered after fact. Monthly, let's make sure that the controlling officers are able to submit their returns and they are scrutinized. And if there is a red flag coming up, there should be a way of correcting that. The problem is we discover that there are overspends after fact, and there's no one to hold accountable. And people will actually, not give you any clear facts around how we arrived there. But I think for Malawi, not just for the elections year, but all the other years, I think we really need to strengthen our systems for accountability. The Budget and Finance Committee has been vibrant. Now we've seen the membership is vibrant. Can they do more beyond just occasional meetings, so that they are really able to, subpoena controlling officers to be able to appear before them and be able to ask the tough questions? The ST, the PFM empowers that office, the Minister of Finance. So I think much of it really hinges on how we can strengthen accountability systems and not creating the loophole where there is a lot of time before you hold people to account. It has to be systematized. If it's monthly, then let it be monthly, so that we are able to get to know. And then also the transparency. If people have made their submissions, let the nation know how the MDAs have performed, and those that have, incurred and explained the expenditures, they should be held accountable. So I think for me, the issue of accountability.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Dr. Ngalande, I would like to draw from your experience 2000 to 2005 when you were governor. And during that time, what do you think were the lessons from that period? And to what extent do you think this could be applied to the current context?
I knew I would be put on the spot. I think Jacob invited me deliberately to put me on the spot. Let me say this. We were effective. Would I be bragging if I said that?
Please. You've earned the right.
Okay. I think maybe we were learning the ropes at that time. Certain things hadn't yet been perfected, and we could get away with actually holding people to account. The example that Linga cited, where funding was contingent on submitting returns, actually it was during that time that it was initiated, and we tried as much as possible to actually make sure that it worked. Of course, there was resistance, as is always the case. But the case of how to fund elections, I think elections have a predetermined cycle. We know that every 5 years we are going to have an election. There's no need to actually leave everything until that particular year so that you bunch everything up. You could actually make sure that the expenditures related to preparations for elections are spread across a number of years. Maybe not quite the entire 5 years, but perhaps starting 3 years before. You prepare and do everything. There's also something that probably adds to the over expenditure, which is that there's too much bickering over things we should resolve way in advance. And you end up with the Electoral Commission being sued, they have to defend themselves and so on. All these are expenses that go towards government expenditure. So we could do away with some of these, agree in advance on how particular elections are going to be conducted, what sort of instruments we are going to use, and so on, so that come the election year, we are not spiking up the expenditure because we are trying to defend something we should have really agreed upon way in advance. And I think let me poke a little bit here on our legislature. I think it's not doing enough to make sure that people are held to account, but also that this cycle is respected and prepared for way in advance. So again, if the legislature could do its part, the executive does its part, and the judiciary does its part, we would have a smoother ride, and that would avoid some of the spikes that we see in an election year. I don't know if I've done justice to that question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngalande. I need to mention that in a short while I'll be asking, I know some of you colleagues have burning questions, not just to the panel, but to the World Bank and the colleagues at the World Bank that authored the report. We may want clarification, so I will revert to you. But Dr. Masanja, given that interest payments consume over 50% of domestic revenue, what should Malawi do to reduce its interest bill?
If I had an answer to that question, I'd still be in government. But in all seriousness, I think two things we can do. Number one, first things first. We have a very high interest bill. So in the immediate term, we need to go for domestic debt restructuring. We are always of the mind that debt restructuring has to do with foreign debts. But Malawian problem is not foreign debts. Our interest payments are to local banks. So it's time Ministry of Finance gathered the local banks and said, you are our children, but we are not paying. Change this and change the other thing. We want to lighten the burden. The banks are from Malawi, they are not going anywhere. They will complain for the next month, and that's it. If you remember, when DPP went into government 2014, they found expenditure arrears. And then they said, these arrears are too high. We are not paying. We are going to give you treasury notes. So they converted the arrears into treasury notes and paid over time. They failed, they rolled over, and so on. So there's something that we need to do about the stock of debt currently that government has, renegotiate with the private banks. The IMF will not like it. The banks will not like it. The Reserve Bank will not like it. But we, the regular lecturers, will like it. That's the first thing. Debt restructuring. Restructure with those to whom you have a higher interest liability. The second, again, the Reserve Bank may not like this. I believe we have the wrong monetary policy framework. Government is the single largest borrower in Malawi. The Reserve Bank is a banker to government. Why would the banker to government set the interest rate so high that its own major stakeholder is failing to borrow or it's borrowing at a penal rate. So you have the wrong monetary policy. The Reserve Bank of Malawi, and a number of them are my students, they have a monetarist position on monetary policy. In other words, they always believe without evidence as an article of faith that money growth causes inflation. If you give them numbers which show that in Malawi, inflation, 52% is driven by food, and a bigger portion, or like 30%, is driven by movement in the foreign exchange rate, not money growth, they will still not accept. Therefore, they are raising interest rates to fight inflation when that's not really the problem that Malawi has. Deal with the food problem, inflation will go down. So my argument is, if the Reserve Bank were to lower the policy rate now, it wouldn't affect inflation. It would just affect the government's liability in terms of interest. If we want to deal with inflation, let's deal with AIP and availability of maize, if that actually helps. Alternatively, let's just have some commercial farmers grow all the maize and flood the market. We will deal with inflation and food security in one go. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Professor. Yeah. So, Dr. Bangarachikadze, I need to go back to the issue of debt because it's always looming large, and the impact on the fiscal space is really, really huge. So my question is, how can Malawi reduce its reliance on high-cost borrowing and be able to rebuild its buffers? And what credibility signals, such as fiscal rules or more independent oversight, would you advocate to lower borrowing costs?
Thank you. I think that I would like to agree with my prof. These high borrowing costs, normally they are domestic. So much as we have external debt, but the government is 100% or maybe over 50 borrowing domestically, and this is short-term debt. And short-term debt, it means it's maturing, quickly, faster, and it's not actually at the pace that the government is collecting revenue. When we are talking about debt to government, and we talk about interest payments, it's the same interest that is coming, set by the central bank, 26% currently. And the banks will tell you 7%, 8% over the policy rate for those individuals who are borrowing from the bank. But when it comes to the public, it's still high. And so, apart from just looking for concessional borrowing, because I believe going to the domestic debt, it means these other avenues are not readily available. There's something that the government needs to do first to sort itself out, and then open the other avenues to concessional borrowing. And I think a credibility also comes in. If the government could do, like I said previously, it doesn't have a financing problem. It has a fiscal discipline problem. And if it just sorts, the way it spends, it's something that I think can be done, because we're spending more, we are not collecting more. You are creating this deficit year in, year out, and every year we budget for that deficit. How we are financing it, we even budget on how to borrow. And so if we could sort that first and start reducing the deficit itself, because we know markets don't lend on hope. They lend on rules. And a government that cannot control spending, it cannot control even the borrowing costs. So you cannot say, okay, could you please reduce the interest rates? But you cannot control how much you're spending. I think those things don't go together. It has to start controlling its own spending first. If we're talking about cutting costs, expenditure, maybe fuel and what, it should go all the way, and there should be visible results on how much we are cutting, how are we spending those cuts, and from there, if the visibility is there that we are into doing well, I'm sure some openings of concessional lending might come. But we are going domestic just because I think these other venues are closing. So for me, I would say I think credibility is maybe the cheapest form of financing Malawi will ever find. If we don't have credibility, the results are what we are seeing. We will not be able to borrow cheaply if we are not credible. And those who are in finance, they know it's not just about government, it's just about even individuals. So you need to build credibility in terms of financing, in terms of spending, in terms of everything. But I think as we are now, we talk much. So it's not about maybe the technicalities that we need as a country, but it's about the political will. It's about what we can do as a country, knowing the problems that we are in and walking the talk given the problems. So for me, credibility first, then you can talk about others, feeling sorry for you. And then the monetary policy comes in because agreeing with Prof, if you see the variables that the Reserve Bank is using, it can constrain the banks. The LRR, it can constrain anything, including the policy rate being high. But you might see that go to the next quarter, money supply still goes up. So it means that even though we are trying to constrain credit creation, the bank itself is creating it for the government. And what is it that we're trying to achieve? Because in there, monetary policy is shooting itself in the foot. So without belaboring the points, I think adding on what has been said already, let's be credible. Okay. Thank you.
So on credibility, I have a provocative follow-up. It always disturbs me where I see the Reserve Bank apparently complicit with the misbehavior by the fiscus. Look at how they have been active in deficit financing at the Reserve Bank. Now, where do we go from here? When you see the Reserve Bank being very, very active in monetary financing, I think that monetary financing must be legally prohibited. What do you think?
Prof is even saying, it's obvious when the Reserve Bank becomes a government ATM, price stability becomes elusive. There's no two ways about it. And like I was saying, you might see policy rate being high, money supply is also going there. And especially when you see fiscal dominance, ruling every time, and then, which is actually a silent killer of central bank credibility. Remember, I was talking about credibility. And for central bank to talk about the credibility, it has to walk the talk. It wants to control inflation, for example. How do you control inflation? You shouldn't be on the other part financing it. And so you also see fiscal dominance coming in and then, destabilizing what you want to achieve anyway. So I think unless indeed the Reserve Bank is protected to deficit financing the government, then I think we might see some changes. But otherwise, it's something that I think when we see across the years, every time the government is stuck, it runs to the Reserve Bank, and it makes it difficult because if you see how maybe the governor and everyone is chosen to be the governor, it has to be please, it has to please the government or the president. And that also creates something, a problem. So I think, for us to build that a credibility and protect the central bank from this, then I think it takes a lot. It takes political will. It takes that a strong demarcation to understand that the central bank indeed needs to be independent. I don't know what can happen if the government will say we haven't paid teachers and health workers and we need funding, and the governor says we can't do that. I'm sure the next day we'll be fired. Maybe Dr. Galande will highlight on that, but I think we need to do more. But this is, I think, something that we need to do, because if the RBM is protected, from deficit financing, then I think the fiscal problem that has been disguised, as a monetary one can also be eroded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. I thought let's move to the exciting mining sector. The public finance review raises significant concerns about the readiness of the mining sector to be able to achieve significant revenue gains for the country. And it urges policymakers in government to manage public expectations. And having had a key role in the economic planning process, Dr. Masanja, what would you advise policymakers to do in order to make the most of this potential windfall? And can Malawi realistically avoid the resource curse that has seen most African countries and governments being plunged into instability? And given the rising expectations of mining and mining revenue, even before production has begun, you can actually see we already excited about it, that it's going to bring windfall, and maybe it will be the end of our problems. What should be the kind of a policy approach to managing these mining resources? Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I think before I deal with the policy dimension, it's very important to also make the point from a case study. I used to be PS for energy and mining, and I had a very bad experience at that time. But even when I was in Treasury, when Paladin was coming on stream, government and Paladin had a mining development agreement. In the mining development agreement, government and Paladin went to the community in Kairekera and asked the community what they wanted in terms of community license. And the community in Karonga and Chitipa agreed they wanted a primary school and a secondary school at Kairekera. Government and Paladin wrote that into the mining development agreement as community license. When the mine was about to start operations, the people of Karonga took government and Paladin to court, and they got an injunction. Their argument was, we want the money for the secondary school and the primary school to go to Karonga Boma and build a water treatment plant. Government and Paladin are not from Karonga. They are not from Chitipa. So they just say, if that's what you want, that's what you get. Paladin had to borrow $10 million to build the water treatment plant for Karonga. When you go to Kairekera today, it's very poor. Now all these CSOs and Malawians would then say, Paladin did not help this place, did not help this place. Well, Paladin had a plan to help the place. But NGOs from Karonga and the people from Karonga took all the money and built a water treatment plant, which failed after 5 years. As we are speaking, government had to borrow additional money elsewhere to build a new water treatment plant. But the people who are affected by the mine got zero benefit. So it's not just government. There are a lot of stakeholders that will come out of the woodworks pretending to help people. They have little knowledge, they have little accountability, and so on. Now let's come to government. The Malawi government, as the report has shown, has a lot of fiscal problems. And they are looking for any sources of finance that can help them. Therefore, there will be a temptation that any revenues that will come from mining will help Malawi government to plug some holes. But at least the understanding that we may have is that mining results from endowments that should apply to all generations. Therefore, in using the revenues from mining, government must bear in mind that there is intertemporal and intergenerational equity in the use of mining revenues. And therefore, I would recommend, now that mining is not yet full throttle, government should design a sovereign wealth fund. Now, when we don't have the money, when the money starts flowing, you can no longer do a sovereign wealth fund, because I know Malawians. Okay? And I know the way we behave, even those of us as people. When you get gratuity, you can't plan after the gratuity is in your hands. So government needs to design a sovereign wealth fund. Out of the sovereign wealth fund, then government should have investment rules, which say this portion of income out of the sovereign wealth fund gets to support the budget. This portion gets to support social protection. And this portion is for future generations. Because some of these mines, like Kairekera, they are short-lived. They will take 15 years and you're out. How do the next generations know that there was Paladin or Kairekera or Lotus here? We need to have that conversation now and do the designs now. Second, the mining fiscal regime in Malawi, they have modernized it. It may have some loopholes here and there, but it's fairly solid. The problem you have in Malawi, in all sectors, not just mining, is not the existence of a law, a policy, or a framework. Our problem is lawlessness. In other words, laws exist. We don't follow them because those that were given the mandate to enforce the laws don't enforce it. If we could only enforce the laws that already exist, we would be fine. So, as we are going into mining, you can see that we are failing to enforce policy on artisanal mining. People are just digging for gold all over the place. We are not regulating, but we have an idea and a framework for artisanal mining. So when this actual mining starts, again, we have made our law negotiable. Although we have a law, the elements of the law are negotiable in mining development agreements. To the extent that the law is negotiable, then you have a problem. The PFR says we needed a model law so that when a mining company comes to Malawi, we just give them the model law. We don't even have to negotiate on the terms of the law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think my next question, I think I'll first have to come back to Dr. Chikadza. And then after that, I'll go to Dr. Ngarandi on the same question because he has raised it towards the end. The sovereign wealth fund. It has been floated, and the Prof here has really passionately talked about it. Would creating a sovereign wealth fund for mining revenues, can it help stabilize Malawi's fiscal position? Or it might simply add another layer of governance risk.
Okay. So I think it still borders on what Prof has said. Because a sovereign wealth fund on itself is not just a magic box. That the moment you create it, then things will work. If we are a country of lawlessness, this lawlessness goes almost everywhere. And the funny thing is no one gets punished. I remember when we were starting this conversation, he says, you've never seen anyone maybe being punished for breaking even the public financial management, rules. But here we are. So I believe that it can amplify governance, system problems that were there if not properly done. just because we are a country that tend to overlook even certain things which are important. In other countries, when you look at mining, as maybe in economics, we talk about overlapping generations. You want to see things grow from now, you're mining, but for the next 50 years, how much is the next generation going to be getting? But with what happens, if we can budget and use it up in 6 months and no one gets accounted, no one accounts for that. Sometimes things can also be taken for granted in there. So I believe that what a sovereign wealth fund could do, it would store value, but not stability. So we need to fix the mining fiscal regime. We need to fix the governance first, and then we can build the fund. But if the governance is still the same as it is, even the sovereign fund will not give us what it was intended to have. So success of this sovereign wealth fund requires, some strong rules. It also requires integration, probably with the fiscal framework, in such a way that, if we could stabilize revenues, then they should be at least, tightly integrated with the budget, and then it has no off-budget operations, and also operates under strict transparency rules. We can borrow examples from Botswana, from other countries who are doing well. You might see that we have the rules, or we will have the rules, but if we are not following them, the same things will happen, and then we'll just be talking about it as a white elephant. And so mining fiscal regime should be fixed first, and currently, close all, whatever leakages are there, control everything that needs to be controlled. Close the leakages, which are there, and from there, we can have a sovereign wealth fund that is productive to even the next generations. Otherwise, if we don't fix, the same things will perpetuate. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ngaland, what do you think about the sovereign wealth fund?
Thank you very much, moderator. I entirely agree with setting up a sovereign wealth fund, with all the caveats that my academic colleagues have pointed out. I think we need the discipline to go with it. It's not just a question of creating it. It must have rules that govern. It must have a good governance structure that protects it. The professor here talked about knowing as Malawians. We are very excitable people. I always say we love this cycle of alternating feasting and fasting. We are very used to it. I mean, you just look at us when there's a bumper harvest. We go all over the place dancing around, only to starve the next time. So if mining is going to bring revenue flows within a short period of time, I can assure you we'll be so excitable that we'll actually blow it out in a few years' time. Unless the discipline is there to say there's an intergenerational requirement for these resources that we are getting, they need to be spread over a much longer period than even the lifespan of the mining that we are going to carry out, so that the next generation benefits. So we have to be able to invest those funds prudently, so that the fund grows just as revenues are flowing in, we are also growing it, and then it becomes as successful. Actually, if you look at the successful sovereign wealth funds in the world, there are very few. If you look at the countries that have succeeded, they are much more disciplined than Malawians in terms of governance, in terms of rule of law, and all that stuff. You see, you shouldn't have a situation where somebody can plunder the sovereign wealth fund and disappear suddenly, and you can't even trace them. This world is now a global village, but in the global village, there are some that disappear completely. We don't know where they are. And that's the risk that we run with the mining that we are getting excited about. Everyone is talking about this, but some of us are actually scared about it, because I think it will bring untold suffering if we are not careful about it. So, sovereign wealth fund, yes. And the time to set it is now, when we don't have the resources. So that when the resources start flowing, we just look at the governance structures that must, regulate how we manage it, how we invest, how we grow it. And then that will be the success story that hopefully Malawi will one day be known for. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We always talk about the governance structures for these state organizations. But for a long time, we have seen ESCOM being what ESCOM is. We have seen what NOCMA has become. We have seen what the water boards become, and yet we always talk about these governance issues. Ms. Mihoa, I don't know to the extent to which we can have a successful fund, a wealth fund, given the history of managing such institutions.
Yeah, thank you, moderator. I think in terms of state-owned enterprises, the report is very clear around issues of weak governance that do not support the ability for the state-owned enterprises to deliver on its mandate. But there are also issues to do with the lack of insulation of state-owned enterprises from politicization. I think that has been a challenge in Malawi. I think one of the most important things for Malawi to consider when it comes to the state-owned enterprise is really having a very clear shareholder strategy. And I think that's currently lacking. We have seen some efforts of the Ministry of Finance signing, shareholder letters of expectations with state-owned enterprises, but to a large extent they are very ceremonial. They happen in this very same room, and then the next thing people meet again. But there is no very clear ways or mechanisms where actually the board and management of the state-owned enterprises can actually account for the KPIs that they have agreed to with government. And even when there's deviation from what was supposed to happen, there are no clear sanctions. You have CEOs from state-owned enterprises that have their contracts renewed. They're supposed to be performance-based contracts, and they have the contracts renewed. But when you look at the institution itself, it's actually on its knees, and you tend to wonder, why would government really renew the contract of this CEO when actually the institution that they're heading is on its knees? It has not performed. What is the basis of measure for performance there? So I think a lot of cleaning up. Government has got to be very clear when it comes to state-owned enterprises. One of the key issues for dilemma, which renders the SOEs also non-functional or paralyzed, is the lack of clarity in terms of where do they draw the actual direction from. So, they're in between the Ministry of Finance as Treasury. They want to make sure that they can plow some resources into the economy. You have statutory cooperation, that's largely administrative, and then the state-owned enterprises also have their line ministries. Sometimes there is variance in terms of the policy directions that those three entities give, and I think it cripples the state-owned enterprises. There is a report that was done which actually recommended that I think state-owned enterprises should have more board line with Treasury, so that there is very clear oversight, there is very clear accountability, but also, for instance, if they're asking for all these bailouts and whatsoever, there needs to be more scrutiny. So I think a lot more of oversight of state-owned enterprises is important. The government has an opportunity now. They are making, I'm sure, deliberations in terms of who sits on the boards of the state-owned enterprises. There have been mixed precedents there. Sometimes you have very professional boards that are able to offer the needed guidance, that are able to even navigate through the political terrain in terms of negotiations with the line ministries or OPC or whosoever. And then you also have another extreme where you have boards that are not professional at all, you know. People that go there, the first thing that they're asking for is the allowance sheet to sign. And then they give the management just a blank check to make decisions that they are making without even questioning. And then when you have boards that are also have mixed the professionals and the non-professionals, you have a time where when the professionals are putting a business argument on the table and some non-professionals think that this is not in the interest of the political masters, you get reported to the political masters. So it renders people to be very afraid in terms of making some of the critical decisions that are needed. But I think at best, the government should really make sure that they have strong governance systems of the SOEs, and that runs with professional boards and also the process, a merit-based process of getting the executive management in place. I think that would be one of the key things. And then, of course, as I recommended, I think clarity. I think they should be more leaning towards treasury so that the ST can actually, you know, get reports of these boards and be able to scrutinize them and see if they are performing the way they should be performing. And then, of course, lastly, I think one of the critical things, government has really got a whole bandwidth to review the SOEs. I think there are some that have perpetually been non-performing, some that are not even strategic, but they are still kept, you know, as SOEs draining resources of government. I think it's important to make decisions where some can be closed, those are not even serving the purpose, and even for those that are functioning there in the commercial sector, I think analysis of whether this is best done by a state-owned enterprise or pure private sector company would be important. So I think there's a whole analysis that government can do in terms of the portfolio of the SOEs, and those that are non-performing, not relevant, I think those can be checked out. There can also be some savings made there. And then position those that are strategic to really be high-performing, you know, SOEs through very clear governance systems and very clear KPIs. That would be my input. And the report shows Lilongota Board. My lecturer here started bragging about his tenure when he was in Treasury. Lilongota Board, I had the opportunity to sit there for 4 years. I mean, the board pushed back. You know, there were some papers that were not well done. There was no business argument. The board pushed back, and no wonder we are seeing that Lilongota Board, of course, with the support from the World Bank, they supported a modernization program, has been able to turn around. It was making losses. It started performing well, but I think the tenure of the board, where they were really professional boards, they guided management. They were able to have the gravitas to negotiate with the political ministers when it's not so easy, the issues around tariffs. You need a strong chair, you need a strong board that can go to convince the minister to be able to take on a decision that they'll table in cabinet with the right ingredients of a business case. But you can't do that if you do not have professional boards. You cannot do that if you don't have the right mix of the professionals that understand it. So they can be turned around, but I think there's much more that needs to be done there.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Ms. Miho. I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation for the next few months. But now let me turn to the attendees. Some of you may have questions, others simply comments on what you have observed. I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Yes, sir. Please introduce yourself and then shoot away. Where's the mic? Is Ona helping us with the mic?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Taz Chaponda. I'm an economic advisor currently with the JBJ Foundation. Firstly, congratulations on this excellent forum. Thanks to the World Bank and a really insightful panel. Two quick questions. The first I couldn't help but observe the issue around monetary policy and whether, in fact, the inflation we're seeing in Malawi, which is, basically 30%, very high year on year, where that is arising from. I think it's an empirical question. I think it's important that we have the Reserve Bank of Malawi and other analysts kind of disaggregate very carefully. I asked my AI here, and we're told that in late 2024, M2 growth surged, hitting 51.3% in October 2024 and accelerating to 44.9% in December 2024, and it slowed down somewhat. The point is that Malawi's M2 money supply growth has been high and volatile, surging to over 50% year on year. If you look at that, that has tracked inflation very closely. Even if you pull out the food inflation, money supply is still closely linked to inflation. It's very, very important that we do that empirical analysis because it will help us in kind of diagnosing the way forward, and that too is directly linked also to what we should be doing around the exchange rate policy management, which we haven't touched on very much in this forum. So that was one observation. And then finally, a quick question to the panel. In the presentation, we were given two scenarios of possible adjustment paths. There was what I think was called the big push and the gradual recovery. Given what we've heard about political economy, and I think Ms. Mihoa mentioned the political economy issues, what do we as Malawians believe would be a realistic and credible adjustment path? Big push versus gradual. We have seen the implications, we have seen the modeling. We need to own this as a country. We need to decide what we think our political economy would support. And once we have bought into this kind of social contract, we can then approach our development partners and other friends to say, this is the reform path we believe we can deliver. Until we agree on what is realistic, we will not be able to make credible progress in terms of what is the reform path that we badly, badly need. So that's more in terms of a question for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaponda, for that question and the earlier comment, which was an observation. Let me pick another one, sir.
Okay, my name is Nelson Zoto. One of the things that has come through here is lack of fiscal discipline in our public institutions. So I'd like to understand from the panel, because this seems to be a perennial problem that is occurring or going through ages. Do you think it's now time to have the Senate as part of the institutions that should be able to check the other branches of government if they are going away from the business as usual, as it's been highlighted? I would also like to hear from you, because we are talking about the fair taxing, so that at least a good part of the population should be able now to as well pay taxes and not just milking a few. The government is now trying to implement new initiatives that speaks about the free education in secondary schools as an extension to primary schools. What's your view on this? Is it not going to put much pressure on the companies and the individuals that are working? What is your proposal to government to make sure that at least we are not just increasing the debt or borrowing because we want to fund these initiatives? Thank you.
Many thanks. I Okay, I'll take that last one and then I'll revert to the panel to respond.
Good afternoon. I'm William Mwanza, team leader for the Malawi Value Chains project. This is part of the UK's flagship Malawi Trade and Investment Program supporting increase in exports in Malawi. I'd like to join my predecessors in this conversation to thank the bank for this timely report, but also the panel for the insightful conversation. There was a strong recommendation on the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I just wanted to provide some good news to Prof. Masanjala and the rest of the panelists that this is actually an area that our project is supporting the government on. We're currently supporting a feasibility study on creation of a sovereign wealth fund. And actually this week we are currently conducting consultations on the same. So just to really confirm that this is of course already in the works, as we've also heard from the President's pronouncements. I'd also like to just notify you of a consultative meeting that we'll be having tomorrow, just in case you'll still be in Lilongwe. That'll be with CSOs and academics, and I was just asking my team whether we have already some of the academics on the panel as part of that conversation. It would be good to have you and to get your further insights in that forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think maybe the panelists can start to respond. Maybe start with Dr. Chapondas. What do you believe would be a realistic and credible adjustment path out of the options that were outlined there? If I may start with you, Dr.
Thank you. But I think before we go to that, I would like to comment on his comment.
Okay.
Yeah, because if I had time to just show a graph on inflation in Malawi, you might see that over 50% is still coming from food. And the RBM has all the graphs that they show that if they could just contain food inflation only, and the food is available, inflation could still go down all the way to 12%. So much as we always say inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena, yes, money supply has been increasing as contained the money, as you saw in the M2 growth. I also hinted on that because I was saying we might have a high policy rate, we might contain credit creation, but still you see RBM financing government deficit, and that actually picks on its own credibility as the central bank, which its own main objective is just to control inflation. So much as money supply is growing, but I think food contribute a lot of the inflation that we're seeing in the country. We can talk all about the imported fertilizer, and even the seed and everything. I think it's just a hell lot of stuff that goes into there, and it feeds on into the inflation package. On what can be a realistic, I think, way of doing this, for me, I don't like being pushed, so I don't think the push is good. In the push, it means you'll be forced to do certain things that might not be palatable to the whole population, and not everyone will understand that we are doing this to be there. In this room, and maybe a few other people who are knowledgeable might understand. Academics, when we're talking about let's cut costs, let's reduce maybe AIP, fees and what, we understand. But if you go to the people out there who are the great electorate, and you tell them that we are cutting AIP, the reception is not the same. So I think if we could take the gradual path, you see which things we can do and which we cannot do, because Currently, we're talking about a fiscal mess which we're in. The growth is low. Everything is not working. We need to consolidate things. We need to consolidate growth. We need to be growing, yes, at 5%, 6%, and thereabout for us to reach our aspirations in the MAR 2063. But I still believe that if we are already in a fiscal crisis, we cannot afford a deep slump in the growth. And we need it to be, gradual, and then we recover slowly while doing the right things. And I always say that if indeed, as a country, we were doing the right things without being pushed, we will not be talking about IMF conditionalities. We will not be talking about this. That's why I was saying sometimes we don't even give the World Bank the tough time in doing all these reports and analysis, because if we're not being pushed and we're doing the right things, I think things will be better, and we might be going to that path that we want to grow while not facing the deep slumps in terms of growth and all the pains that comes with it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Prof?
Thank you very much. So, for the sake of the record, he was my professor in college. I was her professor in college. So you're looking at 3 generations of lecturers. I'm saying this because I'm going to disagree with my student. In the book, The Prince, Niccolo Machiavelli makes the point. If you are going to announce bad news, collect all the bad news and do it together. If you are going to announce good news, spread it over time, so that the people's memory should be one of good times. Reforms are never good news. Put them together, all of them hit at once. Let the chips fall where they may. I'm saying this because in 2012, when Bingu died, we had a lot of problems. So we had a package of reforms. I escorted the ST then in Mwadiwa to cabinet to present some of those reforms. So immediately cabinet accepted devaluation, a return to automatic fuel pricing. Then there were some adjustments as well. In our proposals, we had also proposed increasing university fees and other cost contributions by the citizens. So cabinet at the times, they had enough time just to look at the macro adjustments. The rest of the business up to date has never been considered. In Malawi, gradual doesn't work. The only reforms you get in the first round are the only ones you have. So big push here works. That's number one. Number two, Malawians are very afraid of reforms. And not just the man on the street. The man on the street we can deal with. It's the politician. You guys remember the reforms that the late Vice President was tasked to do. If you look at that document, it deals with a lot of the issues in procurement, contracts, management, and stuff. It has never seen the light of day. So, even if we just recommended the government, can you go and read that report and just tell us which of those things you're going to implement? We are already on the way to good public service management. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Dr. Ngalande, what's the right path? Well, there may not be the right one, but what's the most the most realistic path?
No, definitely a big push, all at once. That's the way to go. And by the way, let me confess, I think I'm sitting between 2 of my students, so might disagree with some of their recommendations. But I believe, in fact, when I sat on 2 committees that were preparing for inaugurations of 2 separate presidents. What I said is, which never saw the light of day, if the president is going to make any board reforms, he better do it on the day he's being inaugurated. In the speech, he must articulate everything that day. I mean, everybody is euphoric on that day, on the inaugural day. So whatever the president pronounces passes for law. It wasn't followed the first time, and the end result is that president lost out. That was Bakiri and Bingo. It wasn't followed the second time. That was Chakwera's time. And he too missed the opportunity to actually introduce reforms from day one. So the best is make sure you really hit the iron while it is hot. So don't wait. If you wait for 6 months, you won't make any changes. So if that reform document was ever going to be used, the opportune time was when this current government was coming in. Read it up and say, we'll do this, and pronounce it on inaugural day, everybody will take it. Wait until you have settled down in the office, there will be delegations that will come and say, Bwana, don't do this. It's dangerous. Inflation and food prices. Let me just say this. During the 2000 to 2005 era, or in fact, 95 to 2005, one of the things that we tracked very closely was the impact of food on inflation. If we didn't harvest enough, we made sure there were contingent plans to bring in enough maize, and the price would dampen shortly after, and with it would go down inflation. Not that money supply printing doesn't influence inflation, it does. But the extent to which food does it is far greater. And by the way, let me say something else which I observed also, which is that in Malawi, we tend to think Nsima has got a certain political color. It doesn't. Whoever grows your maize, whether they are of that color or the next color or whatever, when you put the Nsima on the table, it's just Nsima. There's no such thing as MCP Nsima, DPP Nsima, or whatever. We even ate, do you remember the yellow maize? We survived. But a lot of things had been said against it. And yet we survived, and the end result is everybody was happy that there was food around. So I think maize is something that when it has to be grown, don't look at the color of the person who is going to grow it or their political affiliation. Let them grow, and it will help your macroeconomic situation. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngalani. Ms. Miho, I would like you to specifically respond to the second gentleman's question when he's talking about fiscal discipline being a perpetual, that's his word, being a perpetual problem, and whether bringing the Senate as another layer of oversight can do the trick. What do you think?
Okay, thank you. But I'd like to have my word on the choices.
Yes, please.
So I think for me, it's going for the big push. Yeah, I think we have no way out. We really have to see where we are and how far we want to go. And in any case, if you start from gradual, Dr. Betha, the likelihood of falling to the status quo is higher. So you're better off with a big push so that if it's too much, at least you can then have a buffer and fall into the gradual. But I'm so sure that the big push is doable. Government can review what needs to be done. The IMF last year produced a report which pointed to levels of acceptability of major structural reforms. And I think there was a huge recommendation made around which is actually in tandem with what this report has said. Seek alliances, private sector, CSO, parliament, and citizens. And I think for me that is one of the critical points, that if government is going to go for any reform, and we recommend the big push, let them make sure that they can actually have a good communication strategy around that. People should be able to see why they are taking on some of the sacrifices, what's in the horizon. And I think people can rally around that. And I think for me, Malawians have gotten to a point where they just want things to work, and they'll be at a point where they can actually say, if government is doing these sacrifices so that things work, then let us go on the path where we are supporting government to do that. But I think accountability would be very key so that people get to know why are we absorbing these sacrifices. But I think the good thing is even the big push talks about social protection of the most vulnerable. So I think that's a very good way in which we can also approach the reform, where there will be losers and there will be winners, but at least for those that have immediate losses, and if they are in the category of the less off, then there should be measures to do with the social protection. So recommendation for a big push. The Senate, I'm not too sure. Now, I haven't read the constitution that proposed the Senate, but I think the Senate was in the form that was structured in Malawi was to do with the appointed people from special groups, chiefs, women, people with disability and whatsoever. Maybe we should look at the Senate in a different form. But my point is, right now we are sitting on quite a lot of safeguards, if only they were functional. So I am not too sure that we need to go towards another layer of accountability. I think what we have can work. As long as we instill the discipline of accountability, we are able to make them functional, I think it would work. And maybe if we're talking about the Senate, it's probably in a different way than the way it was conceptualized in the constitution that dealt with it. Because you really want to make sure that it's a structure that can actually offer the oversight. But I am saying maybe we can pause that idea and make the accountability systems work, because I think we don't have too many of them in terms of the legislature, in terms of social accountability programs run by the citizens, in terms of constitutional bodies that have been set up as oversight institutions, but also many other institutions that are there to actually offer the oversight that is needed. Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. So the big push, I think, wins. Radical, aggressive implementation of reforms. Because we are in a crisis mode, and in a crisis, you don't do things very, very nicely, although there are delicacies to be managed. I must apologize that we haven't provided enough time to the audience to raise the comments and the questions, but I hope that those who raised some of those issues have ably presented the participants. I really have to thank the panel, Ms. Linga Mihowa, Dr. Elias Angalande, Dr. Winford Masanjala, Dr. Betha Bangara Chikadza, for really very insightful conversation on this particular report. And you really helped to bring some of the nuance into that may not have been in the report, and embed them into a national discussion that we must continue to have in order to make things right for the country and our people. I really have to thank the attendees for being very, very encouraging attendees and very understanding. Some of the questions and responses were quite long. There are 3 professors here, so you should understand. Yeah. So, but they were really meant to bring nuance to the whole discussion. At this stage, my work is done, and I would like to ask the panel if they could return to their tables, and ask Henry to continue with the discussion. Thank you.
Let's give him a round of applause again. We have one last activity, and that is to invite the World Bank Country Manager, Mr. Firas Raj, to come in front and say your vote of thanks, and thereafter close this session. That will take just a few minutes from now, so bear with us that we've already gotten beyond what our schedule was. Over to you, Firas.
Thank you, Director of Ceremonies, Henry Chimbali, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. Let me start with an immense word of thanks again for all of you joining us today. Today's launch is not an end of a report, but hopefully an effort to support a renewed and collective effort to strengthen Malawi's public finances in the service of all Malawians. The Public Finance Review builds on Malawi's own PFM strategy from 2023 to 2028 and aligns with the ongoing fiscal reform supported by partners. It offers, again, a practical set of options to enhance revenue mobilization, raise the efficiency and credibility of spending, and deepen transparency and accountability across the public sector. From our view, the timing could not be more important, as recent analyses highlight Malawi faces a constrained macro environment with high inflation, tight external conditions, and elevated financing needs, making every kwacha of public spending and every kwacha collected matter even more. Allow me to thank our great moderator, Ephraim, and our distinguished panel of speakers, and to highlight, with your permission, a few takeaway messages from their valuable interventions. Dr. Bertha, in her remarks, stressed that Malawi, in her view, does not have a financing problem, but rather has a fiscal discipline problem. The country can do much better at collecting revenues and at rationalizing expenditures. It must also work on setting up a strong governance framework for a potential sovereign wealth fund for the mining sector. Dr. Winford spoke about the urgency of restraint and the need for modeling this conviction in government behavior and putting in place true commitment controls. He also emphasized the importance of fiscal accountability and making sure that the budget is treated as a law and, in his words, not a suggestion. Dr. Ilyas talked about the instruments of over-expenditure and the need to tackle some of these instruments more effectively and transparently. He also endorsed the idea of setting up a sovereign wealth fund with the appropriate rules governing its operations, and this is for the mining sector. And Ms. Linga, from her perspective, emphasized the importance of practicing fiscal prudence, prioritizing reform, and being consistent with that reform agenda. She also highlighted the challenge of isolating SOEs from political pressures and the need to develop clear shareholder strategies and to increase accountability and oversight. On the fiscal adjustment scenarios, I think Ephraim said it all. I think there were two views: a majority view of hit once with a big push and let the chips fall where they may, and a minority view highlighting the desirability of taking things gradually, subject to the political economies of the country. Allow me to also underscore, with your permission, three key takeaway messages from the report itself. First, mobilize smarter revenues, strengthen tax administration and compliance alongside a fair and predictable system. Second, spend better to deliver more, improve budget credibility and execution, and tighten the link between priorities and allocations. And third, govern transparency, publishing comprehensive debt and SOE information, expanding e-procurement and open contracting, and strengthening intergovernment fiscal transfers. The World Bank will continue to be a partner in implementation through policy dialogue, technical assistance, and operations such as the Fiscal Governance Program for Results that supports results in revenue, expenditure, procurement, SOE oversight, and transparency. On behalf of the World Bank, let me express our appreciation to the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning and Decentralization, and all institutions that contributed to the preparation of this report. especially the Reserve Bank of Malawi, the National Audit Office, Public Procurement and Disposal of Assets Authority, the PPDA, the National Local Government, Finance Committee, line ministries, local authorities, civil society, private sector, and all development partners. Your candid engagement today and commitment have shaped this review and will be decisive for its impact. Before closing, I'd also like to recognize the presence of PS Lucky Sekweze, who is the PS in the Office of the First Vice President, Right Honorable Dr. Jane Ansa. Thank you, PS, for joining us today. I'd also like to express my appreciation and thanks to all the government officials present here today, especially from the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning and Decentralization. Thank you one and all. I hope you enjoyed this event, and we look forward to seeing you again in the new year in January. We will be launching our next economic monitor at the end of the month in January, and it will focus on trade and increasing exports. Thank you one and all again. A big zikomo kwambiri. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Firas. Distinguished delegates, this marks the end of our event, which started in the morning, ending this afternoon. Just a few things for you to take note. We have the reports, printed reports, but largely the overview of this. Please, as you exit, you can ask for one. As we always advise, take it if you're going to use it. If not, leave it so that we should give it to the next person who might even use it much better than you. Second is that you can also download the entire report. On the agenda, there's a QR code. Just scan that with your phone. It will going to take you to the website, read the overview, and download the report as well. There's lunch. As you also exit, get a coupon for lunch. It's up there in the foyer. So please, as our gratitude or vote of thanks to you for your attendance. If you have any feedback, please let us know. The team is here, and we will be gladly take it so that we improve in the way that we do and disseminate our reports. But thank you so much. Enjoy your day, and good day. Thank you so much.
Which is happening here at BICC, which was done by the World Bank, which was the Malawi Public Finance Review Report launch. It's been launched. This is simply, like I said, a report that simply gives an idea of how the finances of a country, any country, like I said also that the World Bank is mandated to give such kind of reports at any 5 years or 4 years, depending to the economic setup of the particular nation, but also just to give an idea of what was in the report. Many things have been discussed here because we also had a panelist which was having a dialogue, a discussion on some of the issues pertaining to our nation finances. We had Dr. Betha, we had also professors from the UNIMA. We also had different stakeholders right here giving out their ideas. But also one of the things that I took out was an idea to say that Malawi doesn't really have a financial problem, but a physical discipline problem, which can be dealt with by practical steps and practical policies that we can implement and put in place. There was an issue of accountability that was raised here to say we have to be accountable in our budgets and everything, but also we have to treat the budget as a law, not just a suggestion that people sat down at the parliament, discussed, and come up with. But we have to treat it as a law so that whatever comes contrary to the budget itself, it has to be treated accordingly. And another thing that was also said was to prioritize reforms. As a nation, we need to make sure that all sectors and all areas that are associating with finances have to be reformed, and to make sure that that brings to the place of accountability. From the entire team of Zodiac, my name is Sunganan Slia. Keep it Zodiac.